Right. Well, thank you all for coming. This is the listening/recording panel. Last year we did a panel talking more about recordings, and we thought this year it'd be interesting to talk about what makes a good recording and the process of that. So I'm going to pass the baton on to maybe Bob, if you would like to start. We had discussed the other day about what makes a good recording, and everybody can chime in on what your thoughts on that would be.
I am trying to. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I'm trying to find that piece of paper that we all wrote down on.
I'll send it to you.
Thank you. I don't want to say things I'm not supposed to say.
Let's see.
But while you're looking for that, I'll tell a little story. Um, Many years ago, when I was a teenager, I went to see Harold Wright for a recommendation or something, and I told him I was making a recording, and he said, "Oh, recordings, they're difficult. The clarinet always sounds bad on recordings." That was the gist of what he had to tell me, and I didn't really understand what he meant by that at the time, but now that I've made many recordings and have a recording company and write recording software, now I know exactly what he was talking about, because clarinet does sound notoriously bad on recordings unless it's recorded really well, and hopefully we'll tell you today what the secret is.
Well, but yeah, just to go on to that before we get into the written stuff. Thank you very much. I got it. Was that I remember buying records years ago and vinyl records, and you listen to the clarinet, and you're right, Jonathan. It sounded pretty crummy, and you're trying to figure out why does it sound bad. And I remember at that time people saying, "Yeah, the clarinet doesn't record well. The clarinet doesn't record well." And when I finally got into it myself, it was the same thing. That all of a sudden somebody said, "Oh, well, if you use this mic or do this, then it sounds a whole lot better." But anyway, for the teachers here and for any students who might be in here listening to this, I just have a couple of things that I want to touch on. First of all, one is YouTube versus commercial recordings. So when your teacher tells you, I'm working on this piece, you're working on this piece, and the teacher says, you should really go and listen to this. I mean, you can go to YouTube, and a lot of our commercial recordings are now available on YouTube. But, hearing Joe Blow from Waving Grass State University play whatever piece is not necessarily going to be what you want to do. You want to find a really high quality recording. And most universities have Naxos available, and there are some fine ones in there as well, or a variety of other Spotify and a variety of other things you can go to. I was laughing the other day because when I was in school, if the teacher said you had to go find a recording, if it wasn't in the university library and you didn't own it, and your teacher didn't own it, you'd have to go order it. There was a record store in Ann Arbor called Liberty Music. It was down Liberty Street downtown, and you would go down and order a record there, but it could take 6 to 8 weeks. It was like ordering a catcher's mitt from Sears, and it could take 6 to 8 weeks to get it, and by that point you're done with a piece. So you guys are really really lucky. The other thing was that the recording engineer that I use, his name's Clark Rigsby at Tempest Recording, and he says every single student should record, because you find out as soon as you're doing something, we have done it too, all of us, you find out how little you know about the piece or how badly you play it when you all of a sudden record it the first time and you listen, you think, holy smoke, do I sound that bad? And I was showing up. I mean, I for years had this Tascam recorder, and one of my students took it. I wish I could remember which one. So I bought a new one, for $99 or something like that. You can get this. And is it high quality recording? Not high quality, but you can then download or just listen through the back through earpieces, and you can actually hear what you're doing right and doing wrong. And I think that's really important, particularly for clarinetists. Pitch is really important. We were doing a recording for one of my students, and I ended up producing a lot. A lot of students do DMA projects that are recordings. And one student said, "Well, that's just an out of tune note on my horn." And the recording engineer said, "Not today, it's not." And so, I mean, and I remember producing another recording where somebody said, "Well, can I just play it slow and you can digitally speed it up later?" And yeah, you can, but the recording engineer said, "No, I don't do that." So anyway, those are my two things to just start with and just to shoot out. I feel like I can say more of this stuff now that I'm older than when I was younger. That but the YouTube thing is the one that really aggravates me because they'll say something simple like, let's say they're doing a French contest piece, like one of the Messager Robot or something like that, or Pyrenees, and you say, you really need to listen to this, and they come back with the weirdest interpretation ever.
Yeah.
Where'd you hear this? Oh, I heard it on YouTube. And anyway,
Yeah.
I,
Yeah, no, that's all very true. And what you say about, learning from recording, it's like I always say if you really want to learn a subject, then the first thing you should do is teach it.
yeah.
If you can teach it to someone, that means you have to understand it. So, and the same thing with recording. If you want to learn how to play something, record it, and then you learn how to play it. And then hopefully eventually you can play it as well as you recorded it someday. You know? But yeah, it's the thing about the sounding bad is the problem is the clarinet, depending on which angle you record it from, sounds very bright. And the closer you get to any instrument, the brighter it gets. And the clarinet is strange in that the high frequency stuff comes out of the tone holes and the low frequency stuff comes more out of the bell. And what most people do when they record is they put a microphone in front of their clarinet, so they're going to always sound too bright. And so what you need to do is you have general microphones that are further away, but you want to also have a mic in front and a mic down low. And then when you do the mixing, you have to mix those two together and make sure you put enough space around the recording to make the recording sound good. But you'd be surprised, there are virtually no recordings of clarinet where it's done properly. When I say no, I mean, maybe a tiny percentage. Most clarinet recordings, this is what Harold was talking about, because he never liked the way he sounded on recordings, because not his problem, but they didn't do a good job recording him. He played well. I heard him live and it sounded great, but on the recordings, it's always too bright because of that.
And of course, the closeness of the miking, you mentioned the space makes a huge difference. I had an engineer that did some solo and ensemble pieces. Chuck Eller, who's now moved to Mexico, comes back here in the summers. He's famous for doing a lot of rock bands, northeastern rock bands. But he had a special clarinet mic that Steve's coming in, so he'd go into his cupboard and pick out this. I'll have to ask him what it was. I think it was one of those expensive Neumann mics or something. But he said that worked on clarinet. Very good ear, by the way, he had. So
even when I played, you've probably played things like Prelude, Fugue, and Riffs or something like that with big band where you need to be mic'd. Even for that, someone a long time ago gave me this special mic where there's two mics on one little thingy, so that one can go down below the bell and one in front of the keys. So it's not just the standard, bandstand mic in front of the saxophone. With the saxophone, it doesn't matter. Saxophone is a buzzsaw, and that's what it's supposed to sound like in a big band, right? but a clarinet, when playing if you want to come through the big band, you need a mic. And so this two mic version gives you a much better sound than the one mic in any case,
One of the things that I do, and I recommend to my students, they can have an attachment even on their phone that gives them pretty good quality audio just for practice recording. Zoom makes a whole bunch of different products. I'm going to throw a link in the chat for something that I recommend, but there's a lot of different microphone attachments you can use, and even just for practicing recording. But one of the things we thought we'd talk about a little bit is preparing for a recording session, some things that we want to think about what our audience is listening for in that preparation. And so again, I'll pass the torch a little bit, but one of the things I think we talked about, Bob, you had mentioned the formula for how many minutes of music, and I think that's a really important place to start.
I remember once I did a recital at ASU, and the student came backstage afterward and just was absolutely aghast. And he said, "You squeaked." And I said,
forbid.
and I remember looking at him and saying, "Boy, thanks for pointing that out. I didn't know."
I didn't realize.
And so the one thing that happens in recordings that people don't think about is that they listen to you play or listen to somebody play, and it's like this perfect recording, and they don't understand that that's not real. So I mean, it's like airbrush photographs. But what you do is that the general formula is 1 hour for every 5 minutes of music. So if you have a 60-minute recording, that could take up to 12 hours to record. Obviously, you're not going to do all that at the same time, but it does take that amount of time, because what you're doing is you're taking section by section, sometimes measure by measure, or in some cases note, and taking that out and pasting it in someplace else. And when they're using the software that they're using now, they can splice virtually anywhere with anything, with the crossfades and everything. So you're hearing perfection. You're not hearing what actually went on. And if I've been in a situation where we've gone down to like one measure and then one beat and then one note to try to get something work. But yeah, 1 hour for every 5 minutes is the general formula. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and as we all know, we think we're prepared until we get in there. And it depends on the kind of studio you use. I like using a really dry studio and having the reverb added afterward, because then you can splice everything, because there's just nothing there but the sound, and you can splice wherever you want. Um, and you can juice it up electronically. Some people don't like that. Some people want to record in a larger, more vibrant, natural sound room. But all the formula is that you do a lot of work. It's like what I used to live in Iowa. It's like watching hot dogs be made. You don't really want to see this, but that's the way that it all goes together.
Yeah.
Jonathan?
I agree. The 12-to-1 ratio is, I usually say it's anywhere from 10-to-1 to 20-to-1, right? And the 20-to-1 is the really hard stuff or the really unprepared group. So, I did a recording a couple of years ago of the Copeland Appalachian Spring. I was conducting, and the orchestra was, the finest musicians in Hungary, all top players from the top orchestra, but because they're Hungarian, none of them seemed to know Copeland. And most of Appalachian Spring is pretty easy, but there's a couple of parts that are really tricky if you've played it. I mean, it's very intonation problems, very fast, very articulate. And so we did our sessions on it, and the fast parts were just not good. So I said, listen, guys, go home and practice, and we're going to do another 2-hour session tomorrow morning to clean up all those spots. And so in that case, we probably ended up being closer to the 20-to-1 ratio. But if you're doing, a Mozart symphony or concerto or something that everybody knows and, can already play well, maybe that's only 10-to-1. But it's somewhere in that range, and you can splice everything. The thing about dry versus wet is an interesting one, because if you play in a totally dry place, it's a little disconcerting to you as a player. And then you'll have a tendency to want to force more because you're not hearing much of yourself, right? And on the other side is if you play in, a big open echoey space, like Bob says, it becomes harder to put it together later in the editing and balancing process, because it's very hard to remove reverb. It's essentially impossible. You can always add more reverb and spaciousness to the sound, but taking it out is hard. So my personal preference is recording sort of in a medium space that has a little bit of acoustic, but not too much, but that's, personal preference.
That's been my preference too, by the way. But just to back up just a little bit, you mentioned earlier, I mean, Julian, you were saying, so how do we prepare? What do we do? And I think what you mentioned earlier, record yourself first. Be able to play it on the recording and like what you hear. You don't want to hear it for the first time coming out of the sound booth. You know what I mean? Record yourself, record it a lot, and then spend your money on a studio.
Yeah, I also wanted to comment on what Jonathan said about because I should have brought this up too. The thing about the dry rooms are exactly what he was saying. Everything tends to become forced. And I know that I've gotten into those situations and you start to bite a hole in your lip,
Right.
because you think that everything's going to, but what we've done with this fellow in Tempe is that we'll have the person record a little bit, then come up and listen to what we're actually hearing. And then they kind of relax a little bit, but it's still really hard.
Yep.
And that's one of the hardest parts of it is going and listening. And then the recording engineer will ask, do you like this? Is this how you want to sound? And
Right.
and it's kind of absorbing that and everything. What are some of kind of the do's and don'ts of recording? What are some recommendations everybody has for you're getting ready for the session, you're preparing for the session?
Tempo is an important thing. You got to
Yeah,
make sure you know exactly what tempos you want to the 1 beat per minute, not plus or minus 5 or 10, because the more you do takes that are wildly different tempos, again, the harder it is to put together in the editing process.
Yeah, you can't.
you can't splice if you have. I was telling the other day we were talking about the Bob Dylan tune "Tangled Up in Blue" that starts at one tempo and 3 minutes later is almost it's not twice as fast, but it just keeps going. They obviously did that in a long take, but if you try to splice like that, it just doesn't work.
Sure.
Nowadays, the software has gotten more and more powerful, so you can speed things up and slow them down without noticeable effects in the sound. However, if you have to do too much of this, it just gets harder and harder to do it, and it costs you more and more money if you're paying someone to do it for you, right?
Yeah.
'Cause it's more and more hours of editing time. So
Yeah. What I like to do with pieces is play them, see if we can get a playthrough of a piece. And if it's good enough, I mean, if it's 80% good and needs a few edits, then edit those and splice in those. Because then you've got an overall effect. You've got an overall, hopefully it's flowing like it would in a live performance. And then now if it's a really hard piece, of course, then you've got to maybe just do this section and then this section. But then the problem is what happens when you put it together? And that's kind of what we're alluding to here.
There's a question here about talk about using click tracks. I've done it. I've actually had really good luck with some things I've been producing with people who just couldn't get it together, and putting the click track in helped. And I also did it once with a saxophonist. And we found out that the hard thing was that the saxophonist thought on one side of the beat, and I felt on the other side of the beat, and it was really difficult to get that to work out. But the click track does, like Laura said, they use click tracks for clinic choir recording for practice. I mean, sometimes it's really appropriate and it really does work.
but the click track is only when you're recording parts separately. Like if you want to record a quartet yourself and you want to record all the 4 parts, right? Obviously, you need to have it be nice and steady. But a better way to do that is put the sound in your head and play along with it. Because classical music, unlike jazz, rock, pop, movies, radio, broadcasting, all those, is not about assembling individual tracks, which makes the stuff sound manufactured. It's about the ebb and flow. Every phrase, every beat in real classical music has nuance to it, and it doesn't flow metronomically in a computerized fashion. I mean, it might be metronomic for a few beats here and there if it's a very metric section, but real classical music doesn't work like that. So click track is anathema to normal classical music recording. It's used, of course, in rock, pop, jazz, movies,
No.
every other kind of recording, but those are assembly kinds of editing where you're actually recording all the tracks separately. You know, when they show movies and like and when they show a special on the Beatles or a rock group and they show them all sitting in the studio together, they make you think that that's how recording works. That has nothing to do with how recording works. Okay. When you see those pictures, each one of those parts was recorded totally independently of each other. Okay, with a click track and electronically, a wire plugged in. We record acoustically, like you record an orchestra or a chamber music session. There's multiple microphones. It's coming through the air into the mics at the same time. You can't have click tracks for that. You can only have click tracks if you're doing separate track recording.
One of the things we had talked about was how to structure a session. And, we talked about like making take sheets and making that kind of plan. What has everyone done in those situations?
I use take sheets. The producer has a set of take sheets, and then when I'm producing, I actually had this next to me. You can't see it. I use yellow legal pads and write everything down on that so that I know what's going on for me. I think if you're going to self-produce, you got to be really careful about that, and you got to have somebody say, I like this," and that just takes forever. Otherwise, Yeah, get someone. I think it's really best to get a producer. Get someone with good ears that can sit there and listen. The producer that I love to hate. I don't know if he's on here or not right now. Is Joshua Gardner. He's a he he just says things like, that's out of tune, and so I get really angry. But he's really good at hearing that kind of stuff and putting it together. And I've done a lot of producing for him and his duo and his quintet as well, because it's good to have a set of ears. There are two things I just want to bop in real quick if I can. One is make sure that you bring up a metronome and a tuner to the recording session, so that I don't think we said that, so that everything is the same tempo. You can, like we were talking about. The other thing is the pacing. You can't, we were talking about 12 hours. You can't record for 12 hours. I can go for about 2 hours and then I need to go get coffee. But you can't record that long. And if you're going to do it, you need to bring stuff in with you. You need to bring protein bars. You need to bring water. You need to bring coffee. I have a favorite set of shoes that I wear because I tap my foot. And if I tap my foot with these shoes, you can't hear anything. In fact, I was recording with Janice Starling once, a duet, and we actually have a take of her saying, "What stinks? Is that your shoes?" And I'm afraid it was. But so the comfort level, and then we talked about the day of the recording. Yeah, pacing yourself, sleeping the night before, which is really hard, and getting a good warm up in. I think just everything so that you're ready. If the recording session starts at 10 o'clock, don't show up at 10 o'clock. You're paying that person, X number, $100, $200, whatever, an hour to be there. Show up a few minutes early so you're ready to go. So when it hits 10 o'clock, you're starting. Time is money.
Yeah, if you don't warm up before, you're going to be flat at the beginning too. And
Yeah, that's true.
those takes are going to be useless.
And
Yeah,
having, good supply of reeds and all those kinds of things, reeds
Yeah.
for every situation, because you never know what's going to happen in the room. So that's another thing to consider.
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of take sheets and stuff like that, I use my software, of course, which completely eliminates the need for take sheets. Because when you record, you actually record the takes into separate, what are called track groups on top of each other. So when I'm done with a recording session, I have all the takes in time order sitting on top of each other on one screen. Doesn't matter if I'm doing 5 mics or 50 mics, it's the same. So I can see all the takes for everything. So if I'm recording, let's say, first movement of the Mozart concerto, I'll have the whole thing. And if I did 5 or 6 takes, there'll be 5 or 6 track groups filled in with stuff. So if I want to see, here's this take, I can click, play them. In the old days, you couldn't do that with software. And so you had to have these log sheets to figure out where is which number. Oh, it was take 55. Oh, that's where we did measure 39. And now it's just lying on the screen in front of you. And so it makes the whole process a lot quicker. What musicians typically did is you would give a score, score to somebody and say, okay, now go listen to these takes and mark up the score. Again, if you use the right software, you don't have to do that anymore. You can do it live directly, and you skip, several steps in doing it. But the planning, making sure that you're covered, that's the key thing, and that's where a good producer comes in. Because if I produce my stuff, but I also always have a producer there, like Brad Michael or somebody great, because when you're in the middle of something, you can't hear everything, no matter how good your ears are. Especially if you're conducting. Orchestras are noisy. You can't hear if you're the conductor, you can't hear half of the stuff that's going on. They just pretend to, And so I listen. I do a take. I do a take, and I fix whatever went wrong. I say, okay, this, that, and then I'll say, what else did you guys hear? And then in the booth, hey, Brad will say, hey, the second horn was late, and the third trumpet was this, and he was flat. And I say, okay, yeah, I couldn't hear that because they were 30 feet away, and
Right.
Oh.
Oftentimes with Vermont Contemporary Music Ensemble, we would like to bring the composer in, and 90% of the time that works great. But then also another set of ears too, that's not hearing it so subjectively. So I mean, we would even hire somebody, learn this new music score, please, and then come to the session and make sure we're getting it right.
So I'm just looking at the time. We have about
Yeah.
3 minutes. So what
I-
are some things we'd
I
love to
want-
wrap up on?
I want to just ask somebody, because I don't do any video recording really. So is there anything anybody has to offer about video recording that can be talked about in 2 minutes or whatever?
I would just say have a good camera, and then either a good camera with a great audio connected to it. But really better would be to have just a camera and then sync it with the audio you do separately.
Yeah, I would always do the separate audio.
Yeah. Well, there's some pretty good cameras.
I see Kathy is in the here.
I
She's
did
got her
some.
mic off. If Kathy can offer. She had such a great video.
She did.
Thanks. There's, of course, when it comes to the video portion, I'm a DIY person mostly. So I've had to learn a little bit about lighting because I do green screen and I have wound up with no ankles or, clothes and no hands. I mean, these things have no pants, torso and shoes. I mean, these things have happened. So a good pair of lights that come in at an angle like this are not expensive at all. You can get those on Amazon for like $35, something like that. You'll need adapters into the outlets because they're a funny kind of end. And then you're going to want to roughly, just general rules of thumb, a lot of those come with like, there's the natural light, yellow, pink, blue tint. Do you know what I mean? So you're not going to use the blue that much unless maybe you're going to shoot like outer space video and you want to be a little eerie color, but you're going to roughly match it to the lighting, your natural lighting and time of day. So like right now in my room, I would want the white one. We were later in the day and it was sunsetty. I might want the gold one, that kind of thing. So I know a little bit about that amount. And then I concur with what Bob said. I do a fair amount of recording for Omega Recording Studio and Sound Surge. Omega, you're there for 6 hours and you get 3 half-hour breaks. And so eating super high protein and bringing snacks, it's like you do not want to get low blood sugar and loss of focus, fuzzy brain. So I don't think taking things like, watch what you take to eat. Actually, things like, I see people want to take things like bagels, but those can give you low blood sugar too under those circumstances. I say high protein, not too much. Same for video. We're all self-conscious about how we look. That'll help you keep your stomach flat too, but you don't want to get a sugar crash. My other thing would be always to have a variety of reed strength or broken inness. And then if you're not sure, because you don't always know your haul, but if you're in doubt, I say go for something lighter and survive and be able to make your attacks is more important than the big dark sound. Nobody has time for the big dark sound that doesn't come in on time, can't have dynamics, any of those kind of things, different articulations. You never come back.
Thanks,
and when you're recording, you're usually relatively close to mic, so
yes,
it's usually better to underplay a little than overplay. Overplaying always sounds bad. Underplaying can sound great, actually.
Yeah, I know. I agree with you. I was just in the studio yesterday doing James Jose's Symphony No. 4. He always has that mic like right here. I hate it, right? Because it interferes with my vision a little bit. But yeah, absolutely. The reality of the situation is what you have to deal with, not how you wish it was.
Well, thank you all so much. I know it's for time. We have to move on. I think it's to Jonathan's presentation, if I'm not